In a Foreign Town, in a Foreign Land, by Thomas Ligotti. 3. A soft voice whispers nothing. Long before I suspected the existence of the town near the northern border, I believed that I was in some way already an inhabitant of that remote and desolate place. Any number of signs might be offered to support this claim, although some of them may seem somewhat removed from the issue. Not the least of them appeared during my childhood, those soft gray years when I was stricken with one sort or another of life-draining infirmity. It was at this early stage of development that I sealed my affinity with the winter season in all its phases and manifestations. Nothing seemed more natural to me than my impulse to follow the path of the snow-topped roof and the ice-crowned fence post, considering that I, too, in my illness, exhibited the marks of an essentially hibernal state of being. Under the plump blankets of my bed, I lay freezing and pale, my temples sweating with shiny sickles of fever. Through the frosted panes of my bedroom window, I watched in awful devotion as dull winter days were succeeded by blinding winter nights. I remained ever awake to the possibility, as my young mind conceived it, of an icy transcendence. I was therefore cautious, even in my frequent states of delirium, never to indulge in a vulgar sleep, except perhaps to dream my way deeper into that landscape where vanishing winds snatched me up into the void of an ultimate hibernation. No one expected I would live very long, not even my attending physician, Dr. Zirk. A widower far along into middle age, the doctor seemed intensely dedicated to the well-being of the living anatomies under his care. Yet, from my earliest acquaintance with him, I sensed that he too had a secret affinity with the most remote and desolate locus of the winter spirit, and therefore was also allied with the town near the northern border. Every time he examined me at my bedside, he betrayed himself as a fellow fanatic of a disconsolate creed, embodying so many of its stigmata and gestures. His wiry, white-streaked hair and beard were thinning, patchy remnants of a former luxuriance, much like the bare, frost-covered branches of the trees outside my window. His face was of a coarse complexion, rugged as frozen earth, while his eyes were overcast with the cloudy ether of a December afternoon, and his fingers felt so frigid as they palpated my neck or gently pulled at the underlids of my eyes. One day, when I believe that he thought I was asleep, Dr. Zirk revealed the extent of his initiation into the barren mysteries of the winter world, even if he spoke only in the cryptic fragments of an overworked soul in extremis. In a voice as pure and cold as an Arctic wind, the doctor made reference to undergoing certain ordeals, as well as speaking of what he called grotesque discontinuities in the order of things. His trembling words also invoked an epistemology of hope and horror, of exposing once and for all the true nature of this great gray ritual of existence, and plunging headlong into an enlightenment of inanity. It seemed that he was addressing me directly, when in a soft gasp of desperation he said, "To make an end of it, little puppet, in your own way. To close the door in one swift motion, and not by slow, fretful degrees. If only this doctor could show you the way of such cold deliverance." I felt my eyelashes flutter at the tone and import of these words, and Dr. Zirk immediately became silent. Just then, my mother entered the room, allowing me a pretext to display an aroused consciousness. But I never betrayed the confidence or indiscretion the doctor had entrusted to me that day. In any case, it was many years later that I first discovered the town near the northern border, and there I came to understand the source and significance of Dr. Zirk's mumblings on that nearly silent winter day. I noticed, as I arrived in the town, how close a resemblance it bore to the winterland of my childhood, even if the precise time of year was still slightly out of season. On that day, everything, the streets of the town and the people traveling upon them, the store windows and the meager merchandise they displayed, the weightless pieces of debris barely animated by a half-dead wind, everything looked as if it had been drained entirely of all color, as if an enormous photographic flash had just gone off in the startled face of the town. And somehow, beneath this pallid facade, I intuited what I described to myself as the all-pervasive aura of a place that has offered itself as a haven for an interminable series of delirious events. It was definitely a mood of delirium that appeared to rule the scene, causing all that I saw to shimmer vaguely in my sight, as if viewed through the gauzy glow of a sick room, a haziness that had no precise substance, distorting without in any way obscuring the objects behind or within it. There was an atmosphere of disorder and commotion that I sensed in the streets of the town, as if its delirious mood were only a soft prelude to great pandemonium. I heard the sound of something that I could not identify, an approaching racket that caused me to take refuge in a narrow passageway between a pair of high buildings. Nestled in this dark hiding place, I watched the street and listened as that nameless clattering grew louder. It was a medley of clanging and creaking, of groaning and croaking, a dull jangle of something unknown as it groped its way throughout the town, a chaotic parade in honor of some special occasion of delirium. The street that I saw beyond the narrow opening between the two buildings was now entirely empty. The only thing I could glimpse was a blur of high and low structures, which appeared to quiver slightly as the noise became louder and louder, the parade closing in, though from which direction I did not know. The formless clamor seemed to envelop everything around me, and then, suddenly, I could see a passing figure in the street. Dressed in loose white garments, it had an egg-shaped head that was completely hairless and as white as paste. A clown of some kind, who moved in a way that was both casual and laborious, as if it were strolling under water or against a strong wind, tracing strange patterns in the air with billowed arms and pale hands. It seemed to take forever for this apparition to pass from view, but just before doing so, it turned to peer into the narrow passage where I secreted myself, and its greasy white face was wearing an expression of bland malevolence. Others followed the lead figure, including a team of ragged men who were harnessed like beasts and pulling along bristling ropes. They also moved out of sight, leaving the ropes to waver slackly behind them. The vehicle to which these ropes were attached, by means of enormous hooks, rolled into the scene, its great wooden wheels audibly grinding the pavement of the street beneath them. It was a sort of platform with huge wooden stakes rising from its perimeter to form the bars of a cage. There was nothing to secure the wooden bars at the top, and so they wobbled with the movement of the parade. Hanging from the bars and rattling against them was an array of objects haphazardly tethered by cords and wires and straps of various kinds. I saw masks and shoes, household utensils and naked dolls, large bleached bones and the skeletons of small animals, bottles of colored glass, and the head of a dog with a rusty chain wrapped several times around its neck, and sundry scraps of debris and other things I could not name, all knocking together in a wild percussion. I watched and listened as that ludicrous vehicle passed by in the street. Nothing else followed it, and the enigmatic parade seemed to be at an end, now only a delirious noise fading into the distance. Then a voice called out behind me, "What are you doing back here?" I turned around and saw a fat old woman moving toward me from the shadows of that narrow passageway between the two high buildings. She was wearing a highly decorated hat that was almost as wide as she was, and her already ample form was augmented by numerous layers of colorful scarves and shawls. Her body was further weighted down by several necklaces which hung like a noose around her neck, and many bracelets about both of her chubby wrists. On the thick fingers of either hand were a variety of large gaudy rings. "I was watching the parade," I said to her, "but I couldn't see what was inside the cage, or whatever it was. It seemed to be empty." The woman simply stared at me for some time, as if contemplating my face, and perhaps surmising that I had only recently arrived in the northern border town. Then she introduced herself as Mrs. Glim, and said that she ran a lodging house. "Do you have a place to stay?" she asked in an aggressively demanding tone. "It should be dark soon," she said, glancing slightly upward. "The days are getting shorter and shorter." I agreed to follow her back to the lodging house. On the way, I asked her about the parade. "It's all just some nonsense," she said, as we walked through the darkening streets of the town. "Have you seen one of these?" she asked, handing me a crumpled piece of paper that she had stuffed among her scarves and shawls. Smoothing out the page Mrs. Glim had placed in my hands, I tried to read in the dimming twilight what was printed upon it. At the top of the page, in capital letters, was a title, Metaphysical Lecture 1. Below these words was a brief text, which I read to myself as I walked with Mrs. Glim. "It has been said," the text began, "that after undergoing certain ordeals, whether ecstatic or abysmal, we should be obliged to change our names, as we are no longer who we once were. Instead, the opposite rule is applied. Our names linger long after anything resembling what we were, or thought we were, has disappeared entirely. Not that there was ever much to begin with, only a few questionable memories and impulses, drifting about like snowflakes in a gray and endless winter. But each soon floats down and settles into a cold and nameless void." After reading this brief metaphysical lecture, I asked Mrs. Glim where it came from. "They were all over town," she replied. "Just some nonsense, like the rest of it. Personally, I think this sort of thing is bad for business. Why should I have to go around picking up customers in the street? But as long as someone's paying my price, I will accommodate them in whatever style they wish. In addition to operating a lodging house or two, I am also licensed to act as an undertaker's assistant and a cabaret stage manager. Well, here we are. You can go inside. Someone will be there to take care of you. At the moment, I have an appointment elsewhere." With these concluding words, Mrs. Glim walked off, her jewelry rattling with every step she took. Mrs. Glim's lodging house was one of several great structures along the street, each of them sharing similar features, and all of them, I later discovered, in some way under the proprietorship or authority of the same person, that is, Mrs. Glim. Nearly flush with the street stood a series of high and almost styleless houses with institutional facades of pale gray mortar and enormous dark roofs. Although the street was rather wide, the sidewalks in front of the houses were so narrow that the roofs of these edifices slightly overhung the pavement below, creating a sense of tunnel-like enclosure. All of the houses might have been siblings of my childhood residence, which I once heard someone describe as an architectural moan. I thought of this phrase as I went through the process of renting a room in Mrs. Glim's lodging house, insisting that I be placed in the one that faced the street. Once I was settled into my apartment, which was actually a single, quite expansive bedroom, I stood at the window, gazing up and down the street of gray houses, which together seemed to form a procession of some kind, a frozen funeral parade. I repeated the words, "architectural moan," over and over to myself, until exhaustion forced me away from the window and under the musty blankets of the bed. Before I fell asleep, I remembered that it was Dr. Zirk who had used this phrase to describe my childhood home, a place that he had visited so often. So it was of Dr. Zirk that I was thinking as I fell asleep in that expansive bedroom in Mrs. Glim's lodging house. And I was thinking of him not only because he had used the phrase architectural moan to describe the appearance of my childhood home, which so closely resembled those high-roofed structures along that street of gray houses in the northern border town, but also, and even primarily, because the words of the brief metaphysical lecture I had read some hours earlier reminded me so much of the words, those fragments and mutterings, that the doctor had spoken as he sat upon my bed and attended to the life-draining infirmities from which everyone expected I would die at a very young age. Lying under the musty blankets of my bed in that strange lodging-house, with a little moonlight shining through the window to illuminate the dreamlike vastness of the room around me, I once again felt the weight of someone sitting upon my bed and bending over my apparently sleeping body, ministering to it with unseen gestures and a soft voice. It was then, while pretending to be asleep, as I used to do in my childhood, that I heard the words of a second metaphysical lecture. They were whispered in a slow and resonant monotone. "We should give thanks," the voice said to me, "that a poverty of knowledge has so narrowed our vision of things as to allow the possibility of feeling something about them. How could we find a pretext to react to anything if we understood everything? None but an absent mind was ever victimized by the adventure of intense emotional feeling. And without the suspense that is generated by our benighted state, our status as beings possessed by our own bodies, and the madness that goes along with them, who could take enough interest in the universal spectacle to bring forth even the feeblest yawn, let alone exhibit the more dramatic manifestations which lend such unwonted color to a world that is essentially composed of shades of gray upon a background of blackness? Hope and horror, to repeat merely two of the innumerable conditions dependent on a faulty insight, would be much the worse for an ultimate revelation that would expose their lack of necessity. At the other extreme, both our most dire and most exalted emotions are well served every time we take some ray of knowledge, isolate it from the spectrum of illumination, and then forget it completely. All our ecstasies, whether sacred or from the slime, depend on our refusal to be schooled in even the most superficial truths, and our maddening will to follow the path of forgetfulness. Amnesia may well be the highest sacrament in the great gray ritual of existence. To know, to understand in the fullest sense, is to plunge into an enlightenment of inanity, a wintry landscape of memory, whose substance is all shadows, and a profound awareness of the infinite spaces surrounding us on all sides. Within this space we remain suspended only with the aid of strings that quiver with our hopes and our horrors, and which keep us dangling over the gray void. How is it that we can defend such puppetry, condemning any efforts to strip us of these strings? The reason, one must suppose, is that nothing is more enticing, nothing more vitally idiotic than our desire to have a name, even if it is the name of a stupid little puppet, and to hold on to this name throughout the long ordeal of our lives, as if we could hold on to it forever. If only we could keep those precious strings from growing frayed and tangled. If only we could keep from falling into an empty sky, we might continue to pass ourselves off under our assumed names and perpetuate our puppet's dance throughout all eternity. The voice whispered more words than this, more than I can recall, as if it would deliver its lecture without end. But at some point, I drifted off to sleep as I have never slept before, calm and gray and dreamless. The next morning, I was awakened by some noise down in the street outside my window. It was the same delirious cacophony I had heard the day before when I first arrived in the northern border town and witnessed the passing of that unique parade. But when I got up from my bed and went to the window, I saw no sign of the uproarious procession. Then I noticed the house directly opposite the one in which I had spent the night. One of the highest windows of that house across the street was fully open, and slightly below the edge of the window, lying against the gray facade of the house, was the body of a man hanging by his neck from a thick white rope. The cord was stretched taut and led back through the window and into the house. For some reason, this sight did not seem in any way unexpected or out of place, even as the noisy thrumming of the unseen parade grew increasingly loud, and even when I recognized the figure of the hanged man, who was extremely slight of build, almost like a child in physical stature. Although many years older than when I had last seen him, his hair and beard now radiantly white, clearly the body was that of my old physician, Dr. Zirk. Now I could see the parade approaching. From the far end of that gray, tunnel-like street, the clown creature strolled in its loose white garments, his egg-shaped head scanning the high houses on either side. As the creature passed beneath my window, it looked up at me for a moment with that same expression of bland malevolence, and then passed on. Following this figure was the formation of ragged men harnessed by ropes to a cage-like vehicle that rolled along on wooden wheels. Countless objects, many more than I saw the previous day, clattered against the bars of the cage. The grotesque inventory now included bottles of pills that rattled with the contents inside them, shining scalpels and instruments for cutting bones, needles and syringes strung together and hung like ornaments on a Christmas tree, and a stethoscope that had been looped about the decapitated dog's head. The wooden stakes of the caged platform wobbled to the point of breaking with the additional weight of this cast-off clutter. Because there was no roof covering this cage, I could see down into it from my window. And there was nothing inside, at least for the moment. As the vehicle passed directly below, I looked across the street at the hanged man and the thick rope from which he dangled like a puppet. From the shadows inside the open window of the house, a hand appeared that was holding a polished steel straight razor. The fingers of that hand were thick and wore many gaudy rings. After the razor had worked at the cord for a few moments, the body of Dr. Zirk fell from the heights of the gray house and landed in the open vehicle just as it passed by. The procession, which was so lethargic in its every aspect, now seemed to disappear quickly from view, its muffled riot of sounds fading into the distance. To make an end of it, I thought to myself, to make an end of it in whatever style you wish. I looked at the house across the street. The window that was once open was now closed, and the curtains behind it were drawn. The tunnel-like street of gray houses was absolutely quiet and absolutely still. Then, as if in answer to my own deepest wish, a sparse showering of snowflakes began to descend from the gray morning sky, each one of them a soft, whispering voice. For the longest time, I continued to stare out from my window, gazing upon the street and the town that I knew was my home.